All right, everyone, welcome. Ready to dive into the MCU timeline?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, we're talking about everything from the very beginning with Iron Man all the way to, well, today, December 28th, 2024. And we're using, get this, the Wikipedia entry on the Marvel Cinematic Universe timeline.
That's right. We'll get into all those little attempts to make sense of it.
So, okay, think back to those first few films. Iron Man, Incredible Hulk, Thor. They didn't really feel connected, did they?
No, not really. They were more like, Marvel testing the waters, I guess.
Right. So how do we get from that to this like mega timeline they have now?
Well, Brad Winderbaum, he's kind of the mastermind behind it all. One of the first things he did was set the 0 point for the whole universe.
This is a 0 point.
Yeah, like the starting point for everything. It's the moment Tony Stark says, I am Iron Man in that first film. Everything else kind of flows from there.
Oh, okay, I get it. So Winterbaum basically created like a fixed point in time.
Exactly. And remember how some of those Phase 1 movies seem to overlap?
Like how Iron Man 2, Thor, and Hulk all seem to happen at the same time.
Yeah. Well, Winderbaum explained that as Fury's Big Week. All those events actually happened in just 1 week, back in 2010.
Fury's Big Week, that's kind of cool, actually. But was that always the plan? I mean, did Marvel know from the start they would be that close together?
It's hard to say for sure. Back then, they were still figuring things out, more like an experiment, really.
Yeah.
But they did try to organize things a bit.
Yeah.
In 2012, they put out an infographic in that Art of Marvel's The Avengers book, which was their first try at an official timeline.
Sounds like a big task, keeping track of it all as the universe just kept expanding.
You can say that again. And then things got even more complex when they switched to a real-time approach for Phase 2 and 3.
Real time, meaning what exactly?
So, like, if a movie came out in 2014, the events in the movie were also supposed to be happening in 2014.
Wow, so the MCU was like unfolding right alongside our own lives?
Yeah, pretty much. But, it didn't always go smoothly. Spider-Man. Homecoming, for example, that one messed things up a bit.
Oh yeah, Homecoming, the 8 years later thing, right?
Right, that title card at the beginning,
Hmm.
because if you follow the real-time thing, only 4 years should have passed since the Avengers.
Yeah, I remember a lot of fans were confused. Did Marvel ever explain that?
Not really.
Hmm?
Later movies kind of just ignored it and went back to saying it had been 6 years since the Avengers.
So 8 years later is basically an inside joke now for timeline fans.
You could say that, but it shows how tricky it is to, keep a timeline straight for something as big as the MCU. And
Uh-huh.
it's not the only example. Things kept getting more complicated, so Marvel had to try a few times to make the timeline more official and fix some things.
Look, how'd they try to fix it?
Well, there's that book in 2018, Marvel Studios, First 10 Years. It had a new timeline that actually gave specific dates to each movie.
Oh, okay, so they were getting more specific, but that's all of everything.
No. It helped, but it wasn't perfect. Then, things changed again in 2020 when Disney Plus launched. They had their own order for all the movies and shows, but at first it was missing some things.
Missing things like what?
Well, any of the movies not owned by Disney, like Incredible Hulk, weren't on there at first. And because of those rights things, Spider-Man, Homecoming and Far From Home were also missing for a while.
So basically, they had to piece the timeline together as they went along.
Pretty much. But then, it's going to blow your mind. Just this year, January 2024, something huge happened.
Oh, okay, lay it on me.
All of the Marvel Netflix shows, like Daredevil, Jessica Jones, all of them, they're officially part of the MCU timeline now. They're canon.
Wait, you mean Daredevil, like street-level crime fighting, is now in the same timeline as, like, Captain Marvel flying through space?
I know, right? And Disney Plus even added all those shows to their official timeline.
That's huge. What does that even mean, though, to be in the, sacred timeline? And what about those darker stories? How do they fit into the rest of the MCU?
Ooh, good questions. We'll get into all that in a minute. It's crazy how this term sacred timeline is suddenly so important in the MCU, right?
I know, right? It's like everyone wants things to, make sense after all this time.
Totally. And that brings us to 2023, when this book came out, The Marvel Cinematic Universe, an official timeline. It's like the most detailed explanation we've gotten so far.
So this is like the timeline book, like the final word on everything.
Pretty much. And it gets even better. It's written from the perspective of Miss Minutes.
Well, Miss Minutes, like the TVA mascot?
Yep. She's kind of like the keeper of the timeline, right? So it's
Right.
like they're admitting that the timeline is messy, but they're still trying to explain it.
I love it. They're basically making those timeline errors part of the story now.
Exactly. So where were we? Oh, right, 2024. Well, this book confirms that in the MCU, it's actually 2026 right now, Ant-Man and the Wasp, Quantumania, and the Marvels both take place then.
So the MCU is a couple years ahead of us.
Yeah. But here's the thing. The book says there are stories that happen outside the sacred timeline, too.
Like, the multiverse stuff with all the alternate timelines.
Exactly. And that's where those Netflix shows come in. They're now officially part of the main MCU timeline.
It's still so weird to think about Daredevil in the same world as the Avengers.
It really mixes things up. Those Netflix shows were much darker, you know.
So will that change the MCU's tone, do you think? Or will they kind of soften those shows a bit?
That's a big question, isn't it? We'll have to wait and see. But let's talk about the multiverse for a second.
Right.
If anything can happen, does a timeline even matter anymore?
That's a good point. The multiverse definitely changes things. It's like suddenly there are infinite possibilities, so it might be hard to keep track of a single timeline.
So how do they make sure the multiverse doesn't just ruin the story?
Well, they might need to create some kind of like hierarchy within the multiverse, maybe a main timeline like the sacred timeline, and then all the other timelines branch out from that one.
Sort of like a multiverse tree? Yeah, something like that. Or maybe there's some kind of rule book for how the multiverse works, so it's not just completely random.
Right. It can't be completely random. Maybe there's a council that controls it or something.
Maybe. Ultimately, they have to make the multiverse feel big, but also make sense, you know? Can't be too confusing.
Totally. But speaking of big events, what about the big turning points in the main MCU timeline? The ones that, like, changed everything.
Oh, yeah, there are a bunch of those. Which one are you thinking of?
Well, what about the Battle of New York in the Avengers? That felt like a real game changer, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It was the first time all the heroes came together, right?
Yeah.
That's when it really felt like a shared universe.
I remember watching that in the theater thinking, wow, this is epic.
I know, right?
Huh.
It was huge. And, you know, on the timeline, it's like a dividing line. Everything
Yeah.
before that feels like setup, and then everything after is the main story starting to unfold.
And then there's Thanos and the snap. Infinity War was a total game changer.
No kidding. Half of everyone just gone. It changed everything for the characters.
And then there's that 5-year jump, too, which made the timeline even more complicated.
That was a bold move, though. We really saw how much Thanos messed things up.
And then Endgame, of course, where they reversed it all and defeated Thanos.
Yep.
But even that, like, changed the world, you know?
For sure. Endgame felt like the end of an era. But it also opened up so many possibilities.
Right. And now with the multiverse, it's like the timeline could go anywhere.
Exactly. Things are getting more complex, but also more exciting. It's going to be wild to see what they do next.
It really is amazing, though, when you think about how far we've come from that first Iron Man film.
I know. From one movie to this whole massive interconnected universe, it's really incredible what they've accomplished.
And we can't forget the fans, right? They're the ones who really made all of this possible.
Absolutely. You're the reason we're all here, diving deep into these timeline mysteries and whatnot.
Speaking of which, we've covered a lot of ground today. We talked about those early timelines, the sacred timeline, and then the multiverse just blew everything wide open.
It's a lot to take in. But one thing I keep thinking about is, even with that official timeline book, there's still a lot we don't know.
What do you mean? I thought that book was supposed to, like, settle everything.
Well, yeah, it tried to,
Hmm.
but they also built in some wiggle room, you know? Like when Miss Minutes pointed out those errors.
Right. It's like they're saying, hey, we don't have all the answers either.
Exactly. And I think that's a good thing, honestly. It keeps things interesting, you know? There's still room for us to speculate and debate, come up with our own theories.
Makes it more fun for the fans, for sure.
Right, because, you know, the timeline isn't just a list of dates. It's part of the storytelling, too. It's always evolving, changing.
So, what do you think? What's next for the MCU timeline? Especially with this whole multiverse thing going on.
Good question. It's tough to say. I think we'll probably see them try to make things clearer, but also there will be those moments where they shake things up again.
We'll have to be ready for anything.
Totally. But at the end of the day, the timeline is just a tool to help tell the story, right? Helps make this crazy universe feel a little more grounded.
Yeah, without it, it would just be chaos. A bunch of random superheroes running around.
Right. No one wants that. So I guess the big takeaway here is the MCU timeline is complex, and it's always changing. But that's what makes it so fascinating.
It's kind of like a reflection of the MCU itself, you know? It started small, but then it just kept growing and getting more complex.
You got it. And who knows what they'll come up with next. But before we wrap things up, here's something to think about. Now that those Netflix shows are officially canon, How do you think those darker, grittier elements will affect the rest of the MCU? Will they lean into that or try to keep things lighthearted?
Hmm, good question. I guess we'll find out soon enough. But hey, you know, while you're thinking about that, why not check out the timeline on Disney Plus Wes? See what you think about how they've ordered everything.
Exactly. See if you agree with their choices or if you think they missed something.
And most importantly, have fun with it. The MCU is all about, escaping into this fantastical world. The timeline is just one part of that.
Well said. Embrace the mystery, the complexity, and of course, the fun.
Couldn't said it better myself. That's all for our deep dive into the MCU timeline. Until next time, keep those theories coming.